Good morning. I'm Sharon Townsend, and good morning, Lee. I'm connected with a small group through Women's Bible Study, greeting, and Bible reading. This morning we're reading Matthew 9, verses 14 to 17. Then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved."
Thanks, Sharon. Well, my name is Zack Thompson. I'm on staff here at Calvary Bible Church, and we started our service this morning by looking at a recap video from this past week at Maranatha. We sent middle schoolers out, and they spent their time looking at the prodigal son, focusing on forgiveness, how we relate to God in the midst of all that. It was a really great time for our students here at this campus to be joined by students that we have at our other two campuses. And it makes me think about how I'm so excited over the next couple weeks to get to go to those other campuses. It's always such a great time of encouraging for me as I'm reminded of the prayers that we receive by people who don't even attend here, and that there are people excited about what God is doing in the city of Thornton, even as they don't live in the city of Thornton. But I'm also going under better circumstances, significantly better circumstances than I went to the other two campuses last year. I was at Erie on Father's Day, and I was at Boulder the week after Father's Day, and the topic I was given was preaching on God the Father. I mean, perfect timing, right? Well, not so much. It was also the exact same week that we had a follow-up meeting with our fertility clinic. And we were told at that time that we had a less than 1% chance of conceiving naturally and a less than 5% chance of an IUI ever working for us. And so I was there smiling at dads, talking about God the Father, while repeating almost like a mantra in my head, "But you'll never be one." And so I'm excited to get to share Everett with these other two campuses because they, like you, have been with us in the difficulty, that they've been a support to us, caring for us in this time, but also want to bring this up because Everett's story is one that's marked throughout by our topic this morning. We're in a series that we're calling Formed, how we have been given practices that help shape and guide us, that form us to be more and more like Jesus. And we're going to look at two of these practices today that have been given to us for the times of life that are considered as waiting, that's full of waiting, and also the times of life that are experienced with rejoicing. And those two practices are fasting and feasting. Now, while it seems like they're opposites of each other, they are very much so interlinked. And one of the reasons why they're interlinked is because they are both fairly misunderstood by modern Christians. For one, there's the neglect of fasting. You talk to most Christians, it's not a part of their life. At least in this country, in this age, people don't really fast all that much. I mean, maybe for super spiritual elite Christians or skinny people, but man, I just don't give up food all that much. Or there's the unspiritualness of feasting, that while there's a lot of times that we eat a lot, apart from praying over the food in the beginning, we don't really see how stuffing our face full of food makes us more like Jesus. But I think both of these comes from a misunderstanding that goes as deep as understanding of how we are made. The Bible is clear that we are body and soul, flesh and spirit. And so as we worship God, we do so not just with these ethereal spiritual practices, but we do so with our whole being, which includes our body, which includes what's physical about us. More so than I think any of these other habits, these practices that we're looking at through this series, while all of them are great, more so than them, I think fasting and feasting speak to the whole person. Because it is a physical, both are a physical action with spiritual intention, which gets to our whole person being formed by Jesus. And to get into it, let me reread a part of our passage for this morning. Matthew 9, starting in verse 14. It says, "Then the disciples of John," so this is John the Baptist, his followers, came to him, to Jesus, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guest mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast." And so we have these followers of John come up to Jesus and say, "Hey, how come we and other religious people are fasting, but your people are not? Instead, you and your disciples are more marked by feasting." So as we get into it, I think probably it's best for us to start with a shared understanding as to what these things are. What is our fasting and feasting really? And we'll take the first one first. We'll look first at what is fasting. Well, in Matthew chapter 9, we see Jesus speak about this. He says, there is something new happening, that I've bringing something new. You don't put old wine in new wineskins or vice versa. Something new is happening right now. And so now is not the time for fasting because I'm here. This is a time of celebration. This is a time of feasting. But there will be a time that I go away and then my followers, then my people will fast. And he's describing the place that we are right now. Jesus has gone away, and so he describes this as a time that his people fast. Now, he's brought something new. That has happened. There's no going back to the Old Testament and the practices and customs that we find there, but he does say that this is a time where his people are fasting, just like God's people always have been. Because if you read through the Bible, there is an insane amount of references to fasting found throughout. Basically, pick anyone who follows God in there, and you'll find a story of them fasting. It happens all throughout. And yet, when we read all of these stories of what fasting is in the Bible, it is always from food, not things. Sometimes it's food and water together, but fasting in the Bible is when God's people intentionally do not eat. Now, I know there's a trend to fast from things. And often the language goes, this thing has been taking up a big part of my life. It's been taking a lot of my focus. So I'm going to give it up for a short period of time so that I can focus on God instead. And I'm so grateful that people can come to that realization and take steps to address it, but it's not fasting. In one way, because whenever we see something in our life take a place bigger than God, that's just called sin. And we don't need to pause from sin. We don't need to break from it. We need to flee from sin. Imagine telling this to someone who overindulges in alcohol. Hey, why don't you just stop being drunk every night for a month? Like maybe as a starting point, but we need as an end goal to be a complete separation and away from it. Maybe we disagree on this point, and that's fine. It's not a hill I want to die on. But I am willing to die on the hill of being pedantic about language. We fast from food. We abstain from other things. The word we're looking for there is abstain. But there's another trend as well to where people give up something, not because it's sinful or taking a big part of their life. It's in fact the opposite. It's something they enjoy and do so in a healthy way, in a way that's good for them. But there's a trend of fasting from this for God. Two things with this. One, again, that's abstain, that's not fast. But two, why? Why do we need to give up something that's good that we enjoy for God? Is our pleasure and God's presence mutually exclusive? That God can only be with us when we're miserable? I just don't get it. No, fasting is when God's people intentionally do not eat. It is the giving up of what we need in our bodies to realize better of what we need more. And it's painful, it hurts as we are not eating, as we are skipping on this thing that our bodies require. Our body lets us know about it, that we get hungry, our stomach grumbles, we start to get grumpy. And yet as we are doing so, as these reminders are in our body that we are missing something, it is done to remind us of what we need all the more. Fasting is not unique to Christianity. It shows up in just about every religion and just about every people group. And yet, the way the Bible calls for us to fast is radically different from all else. Look at how other people fast, and we'll see this to be clear. Grab the most famous faster, probably, would be Gandhi. And the reason why Gandhi fasts, he has this hunger strike, is because he is asserting, he is saying that he wants just and right treatment towards the people in his nation. A good thing to fast for, but that's what he's doing. He is saying, this is what I want to see happen. Or take the fastest growing population of people fasting today, which is people who do it intermittently for their diets. And why are they fasting? For those sweet, sweet gains. For those excellent before and after pictures that they can share. It is them asserting, I want to lose weight, and so I'm fasting for this way. Biblical fasting is not about me wanting things. It's not about me asserting anything in my life. It's not me trying to force this to happen or say, this would be so great if this was added onto my life. Biblical fasting is about me changing. It is about me realizing that God is present in my life. It is me giving up something I need so that I am more aware of God's presence in my life. We halt what we need for our lives because we recognize that God is a greater need that we have. It is a way for us to open ourselves up to the awareness of God's presence. See, when I first became a Christian, I was hearing people talk about fasting. I thought it was just a way to supercharge prayer. That if you really want something, you really want God to do something, you pray about it, and then you add fasting because then God's going to have to listen to you. But fasting is not a way that we assert ourselves, that we try to force God's hand. Instead, it's a realization, God, your hand is active in my life. You're present, you're here. I don't always see that. There's things that distract and overwhelm and take my focus. And so I'm taking out something I absolutely need so that you can be more clear in my eyes. And this becomes all the more necessary as we experience difficulty throughout our lives. See, fasting then, rather than being a way for us to assert what we want, fasting is a response. Fasting is a response to just about every trace of brokenness that we find in the Bible, to just about every trace of brokenness that we find in our lives. And we see that in our passage, that Jesus is saying that while I'm here, while the bridegroom is here, it's not the time to fast because things are great, we're celebrating. But when I leave, that will be the time to fast. Because there's so much in this life that hurts. There's so much brokenness, there's so much hardship and painfulness, there's so much that tempts and traps us. And so we respond to that by fasting. Because fasting is a reminder of God's presence that is in our life. It's a reminder of our need that is for him. And so we take out something that we need to recognize that he is a greater need. David Kakish on the Gospel Coalition gives a list that I think captures this idea of fasting being a response. And he shows us all these different examples of what we fast in response to. He says, so we fast because of our sin and the toll that it takes on others. We fast because as long as we are breathing, our sanctification is not yet complete. We fast because natural disasters ravage the world. We fast because people die of starvation and thirst, lacking the necessities of life. We fast when cancer tears through our bodies or those of our loved ones. We fast because the entire cosmos is groaning for redemption. We fast because Christ has not yet completed the work that he began in the manger. See, as long as there's brokenness in this world, as long as there's brokenness in our lives, we respond to that by fasting. Now, what does the Bible call for God's people to do even more so than fasting? We said it's all over, like all over. God's people are people who fast. But what do we see them do even more than fast? They feast. I think of Leviticus chapter 23, where God gives this instruction. He commands his people, the Israelites, to keep these certain feasts throughout the year. And there's a whole list of them. First is the Sabbath. Then the Passover, which is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, which is interesting because it was a day of fast in response to them realizing the sin that's in their life, but then feasting because of the assurance of God forgiving their sins. And then finally, there's the Feast of Booths. So 6 annual feasts that they were to do, and one that happened every single week that God told them to keep. We still think God doesn't care about the joy of his people? He commands them to feast. And what we see in all these feasts is that it continues with Jesus as well. That here in this passage, that he's asked, why are your disciples not fasting? He says, now's not the time to fast. This is the time to party. That I am here, the bridegroom is here, new things are happening. This is a time of feasting. You read elsewhere in the accusations of Jesus, he is accused of being a drunkard and a glutton. Now, that's obviously not true, but there's a little smoke to that fire because Jesus is regularly at meals. He is constantly at feasts. The importance of feasting continues to show up all throughout the Bible. But where there is a little bit of a distinction, because we talked about how fasting is a response. It's a response to who God is, to all the brokenness in this world. Feasting instead is a remembrance. It remembers what God has given us. It remembers that God has provided all for us, that every good thing that we have comes from above. And so as we feast, we participate in remembering what God has given to us. That as we delight in what God has given to us, we delight by feasting. Now, maybe you're like me, but I have a habit of including like little treats, little pleasures throughout my week, throughout my life. One of the things that we look forward to in our household every single week is we get breakfast burritos Saturday morning, and I do look forward to that all throughout the week. Or when we go out to dinner and it's going to be a new place and I'm excited to try it, I'm going to eat something that I've never had before or just try something that's really delicious, I start to look forward to that. Every time I pull up my calendar, it's like, oh yeah, we're going Friday. Or I'm out running errands and, I'm already out, might as well pick up something for myself and grab a cold brew or a boba or whatever it might be. We have these habits of having these little treats in our lives, which are so good, but don't lock God out of that process. That we recognize that everything that we have comes from him. So as we delight in either what is abundant or excellent or both, we do so recognizing that all that we have comes from God. So in participating in it, we participate in praising God. But we also don't lock other people out of this process as well. That you don't feast by yourself. That instead it's a time for us to be generous towards others, to be inclusive as we pull people in. This is also a way that we help to not overindulge in our feast because there's other people to join us in doing so because we don't want to go too far in feasting. But as we do so, it's in the recognition that we are looking forward to the greatest feast to come. That is no coincidence that the culmination of all history is when we, as Jesus followers, are brought together, seeing Jesus face to face at a feast. And this is good for us because we recognize again how God has made us. He has made us body and soul. So what is good for the body nourishes the soul. And as we do so, we remember that all we have comes from God. Feasting and fasting are connected. They are tied together. Because feasting, or the way that we prepare for feasting is by fasting in both a figurative and a literal sense. Figuratively, we better enjoy the delights that we have when we are feasting because we recognize what God has brought us through in difficulty when we are fasting. But we also get ready to feast by not filling our day full of food. You don't really want to have a really heavy dinner at night if you've been snacking all day long. But feasting and fasting are intertwined in our passage here in Matthew 9 as well. Jesus says that when the bridegroom, when he leaves, his people will fast. And that's the place that we're in right now. We are waiting for Jesus to come back. And so we spend our time fasting. And this is something that forms us. This trains us slowly over time to become more and more like Jesus. As we go through the difficulty of life, recognizing his presence, we fast now, and that trains us until the day he comes back. But we also know Jesus is not absent. He's unaware. He's aloof. We know that he is present, that he's present within us, working. He's the one who's working to form us, and that he is coming back. And so we feast. This is a practice that we do over time that shapes us, that forms us as we take this time to recognize what God has given us, and we delight in him as we delight in his provision. They are tied together. And so why should we do them? Why should Christians now fast and feast? I hope so far we've seen some reasons why we should be doing these two practices, but let me specifically spell out a few more. One, the Bible commands for us to. The Bible regularly calls for God's people to be ones that fast and feast. We can go to any number of passages that do so, and we don't even have to leave the words of Jesus to do so. In Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 16, Jesus twice says in this, when you fast. Verse 17, it says again, when you fast. Notice what that first word is? When. It's not if, it's when. There's no backup plan for this. There's no route B. There's no optional route for us to take in this. It is when you fast. And then Jesus gives instruction on what fasting is to look like for his people, because it's a given that his people will be ones who fast. The same thing is said in Luke chapter 14. And I do mean the same thing is said about feasting. Because in verse 13 it says, when you give a feast. So what Jesus is doing in this teaching is he's telling his people how they are to behave when they fast and they feast, not some understanding of what they might do with their life, because he is describing his people as ones who fast and who feast. Second reason why we do these two things is because Jesus did. Matthew chapter 4 and the parallels in Luke and Mark as well, we see Jesus fasting 40 days in the wilderness, being faithful where Israel was not in the Old Testament. And we talked about already, Jesus is regularly at feasts to the point of being described as other people as liking feasts too much. And as we talked about this series, how we are formed to be more and more like Jesus, well, what's Jesus like? Well, he spent his time fasting and feasting. And third, and it gets to that idea, is why we do these two things is they help to form us. There are two practices that shape us slowly over time. That as we fast, as we feast, as we recognize God's presence and provision in our life, that helps us to live as God calls us to live, to be the people he calls for his people to be. And this is one of the reasons why we see throughout church history, the church has been marked overall by people who both fast and feast. In fact, in my research, there was exactly one group of Christians that wasn't overall marked by a habit of fasting, and that was the American church over the last 100 years or so. So one of the things that we do when we look at church history is we say, if you ever find out that you are alone in a belief, that you ever find out that you have a novel understanding or practice after 2,000 years of God guiding for and caring for his church and them being faithful to him, if we're ever by ourselves in church history, we should reevaluate our position because we're doing things wrong. And so how do we do them? How do we fast and feast? How do we add these on as a practice onto our life? Now, I want to go as practical as I can in this section. Now, that's not going to take away the difficulty of them. It's still going to be hard for us to fast because that's something difficult. It's hard for us to give up food. There's pain that comes from it. But it's also difficult to keep God in mind when we are surrounded by so many good things. It's hard for us to see past that to the provider who's enabled us to feast in those moments. And so even as I give these practical steps, it's not going to take away the difficulty or the hardship of going through these different things. I'm hoping to just give us a shared starting point as we try to add these practices that are so important for the Christian life. Let's see if we can make sacrifice accessible. So we'll start first with fasting. And there's two parts of this. There's fasting as a regular habit. We'll go to that in just a little bit. I think it's a little distracting right now. There's fasting as a regular habit and fasting in response to specific situations, like we see all throughout the Bible. The idea is that these go hand in hand, that our instinct is not to fast when things are difficult if we aren't building this instinct throughout our weeks that we have. So a national disaster strikes or tragedy hits. We rarely have the instinct, we should fast right now. We should fast in response to this difficulty, this pain, because we don't have it as a regular habit as part of our life. But it's not as though during our weeks we're just training for the next bad thing to happen, that our lives are not just emergency preparation. There still is within us difficulty at home, in our own lives, places that we see brokenness that causes us to respond by fasting as well. So we build fasting as a regular habit and as a response to specific times. And there's a few different ways that we can start this as a regular habit. You can start with a meal. This week, I'm going to take one meal that I'm not going to eat. And there's ways that you can experiment with this to see what meal is the best place to do so in your week so you can still function. There's ways that you can care for yourself. Drink lots of water. Maybe as you're cutting out food to drink juice instead. But one meal in this week that you can cut out to instead be a time to remember God's presence in your life. To cut out what you need to remember what you need all the more. And maybe this becomes a practice to try the next week as well, or whatever it looks like to create a regular, sustainable habit of fasting to intentionally not eat to remind ourselves of our greater need. Or go a whole 24-hour period, a day of not eating. Let me share what I did for this. But wait. Didn't we just read a passage in Matthew chapter 6 where Jesus says, don't draw attention to yourself when you're fasting? Am I not undoing any spiritual good that I did by bringing attention to this? It's such a good reminder that there's so many more things that I wish I could say about fasting that we just don't have the time. I had so many more what abouts. Oh, but what about Daniel? And what about this? Or what about that? And we just don't have time to cover them this morning. But this one felt important to address. Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, when he says, don't draw attention to yourself, is speaking about being prideful in fasting, especially as we think that fasting is a way for us to earn something from God or from others. Now, I hope I've been overwhelmingly clear that that's not what fasting is. Fasting is a response to God, to the circumstances of life in this world, to brokenness that we see. There's no earning. There is no asserting ourselves in this. It is us realizing God's presence, us realizing our need for God all the more. And let me also be clear on this. I am no good at fasting. It is not a place of pride for me. See, we were divvying out the topics for who is going to preach on which different practice, and I picked fasting because it's such a struggle for me to get to. I was hoping that in the research that I would find a reason to add this on as part of my life because it's currently been no part of my life. And so as I'm sharing these things, I'm doing so with the understanding of hopefully this is something that's helpful for you as it's been helpful for me in this past week. But I'm also cleaning up this point on Jesus' teaching in this to say we should be talking about our fastings with one another. We should be fasting together. This is a way for us to hold each other accountable, to encourage, to strengthen each other when we are physically weakened by not having food. And we can do so while maintaining Jesus' teaching when we recognize it's not a place of pride, it's not a place of earning for us. All that said, let me show what I did in this past week. And we have a slide for this one here. This was my practice. You could find better ones online. You could find resources and tips that help you care for yourself while you were fasting, while you were not eating. But this is my simple practice that I did in order to fast in this past week. I went dinner to dinner, 24 hours. I ate dinner Thursday night, and I didn't eat dinner again until 24 hours later on Friday night. And as I did so, as I was feeling the hunger pangs and the moments that I would normally be having a meal, I used that as a time to remind me of what my greatest need is. It's not a meal in this time, it's a recognition of God's presence. And so I used that as a time to pray, to specifically pray. And I gave myself prompts to pray for because I was hungry and I needed something to keep my attention. So I gave myself something to work through in this moment. But even then, it was just a simple prompt. I first started by looking to God, and then I looked to others, and then I looked to life. So look up, look out, look in. And I did that one each, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as a way to keep my focus, as a way to turn to God in these times. And then I finished this by feasting with Emily on Friday night. Now, that might not be a wise thing for you to do, to break your fast with a feast. It might be better to go a smaller meal, maybe a smoothie or something like that. But hey, I need to get this done before Sunday, so I was crushed for time on this. I also, as I try to do this again for next week, I want to move it towards a weekday. I did it on my day off because I didn't know how I was going to react. Especially, I didn't know how I was going to react to people that I currently supervise, and I didn't want there to be difficulty there. But we see in the Bible that fasting and a Sabbath are two different things. Sabbath is a feast day, and so I would like to move it to a different time. But my point in showing all of this is not to create a rigid system. This is what you must do. No, it's trying to show us how this can be a practical addition to our life to accomplish this way that Jesus forms us. And he does so through fasting. And we could do something similar in feasting. Feasting as well is something that we do regularly and at special occasions. Sabbath and these 6 assigned times is what God showed, and that's a good principle for us to take with our lives as well. So in our household, we have those moments that we look forward to every week. This is a time for us to feast, to remember God's provision. But we also do this on a larger scale a few different times during the year. I think of our life group. We get together and we do potlucks together. Everyone contributes something with these people that God has brought together in this time. We recognize we've gone through difficulty together. There's things to praise for, that we feast as people that God has brought together as a way to delight in him as we delight in our bodies. Emily and I, we try to have the best meal that we have all year long be on New Year's Eve. We go out to dinner that night and we feast. And we look back at the year that was, we look ahead to the year that is, and what God has done and what he might do next. There's a way for this to be a regular and consistent process for us as well. Now, I do want to end our time with a word of warning. With a word of warning. That food can have an outsized role in our life, either in the avoidance of it or in the overindulgence of it. See, for some, food would be an idol. That it's when things are difficult, that we eat to comfort ourselves, or when things are going good, it's hard for us to stop eating because things are going so well. And so the word of warning would be, if that's the place of food in our lives, feasting is going to be difficult. Because the temptation to overindulge in those times is high. This is all the more reason why we feast with other people, those who know us, who can hold us accountable, who can be a support to us, even as we are delighting ourselves in what God has given to us. Now, on the other side, there are people who physically cannot fast, maybe due to blood sugar or other medical needs, or because it reminds us of our past. It tempts us to avoid food, not for religious purposes, but for body image purposes. Or I mentioned that Emily and I feasted this past Friday, but she did not fast with me the day before because she's currently a food source for a tiny person. And so there are some people who physically cannot fast. But I still think that there's a way to get to the heart of what God calls us to do in fasting, the heart of what this practice does for us. See, in these times when people in our lives are fasting, or when we are setting aside this is a time that I'm going to focus on God as if I was fasting, I think it's just at meal times, again, having a guided, directed prayer. God, I cannot give this up. I cannot. Help me still to see that I am more dependent on you than I am on this meal. And just as in fasting, we are intentionally changing our environment, changing how we're responding to food, we can do the same thing even if we're unable to give up food. This is where we're not at our desk. Our computer's off, our phone is away from us. We with our actions, are making God the focus at meal times as if we were fasting. There's still a way to participate. Now, that being said, and be very clear on this is not medical advice. Never come to me for medical advice. I will lead you astray. But that being said, let's not get to the place where we label something difficult as impossible. Fasting is hard. It is taking a toll on us. Feasting is hard because it's hard to see the provider when we have a bounty in front of us. But that's why we need fasting and feasting, because they are things that shape us and form us. Now, the thing about being formed is it's painful. It hurts. And we're reminded of that every time our stomach rumbles, but we miss out on that with every meal that we take for granted, or every time that our eyes drift from God to something else. So we have these practices as ways to help us to remember God's presence and God's provision in our life. In the book of John, Jesus says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world." And we spend our days, this Christian life is one of fasting and feasting, as we spend our days responding to that first part, to the trouble in the world, and remembering the second part, that there is one who overcomes, as we spend our days fasting and feasting. Let me pray for us. Father, we are grateful for your instruction here, that you give us these practices, these tools that are helps for us to live a life that's for our good and for your glory. That we do so because you have shown us the way in Jesus. We do so because we know that this way is best, it's for our good. And we do so because we recognize that all life is lived with and for you. And so we have these practices to remember that you are present when things are overwhelming, when it's hard, when it's difficult. And we have this practice to remember that you have given us every good thing that we have. There is so much to celebrate. And so let us live lives that is going through the cycle of fasting and feasting as you guide us through difficulty, as you are with us in the aches. And we rejoice and celebrate with others all that you are doing, all that you have done. And we recognize that there is a day coming that we will see you face to face, and we will do so at a feast. We will delight for all time with you, who has given us all to overcome the world as you have. Let us strengthen each other, encourage each other, be part of each other's lives as we seek to live lives formed more and more into your image. So it's to you and you alone we pray. Amen.